Imagine a young girl, not yet a teenager, dressed for the most important day of her life. Her world, once filled with games and childhood fancies, is now irrevocably changed. She is not a woman, not a girl, but a wife. For centuries, across cultures and continents, the story of the child bride has been a tragic and pervasive thread in the human experience. Hello, I am Amy Boyington, and this is a history not of fairy tales, but of power, survival, and the heartbreaking loss of innocence. In the ancient world, marriage was rarely about love. It was a transaction, a way to secure alliances, merge wealth, and ensure the continuation of a family line. For these reasons, marrying girls at a young age was a common and accepted practice. In ancient Rome, the legal age of a girl to marry was just 12 years old. Roman law, as codified in the 12 Tables, permitted a father to arrange his daughter's marriage as soon as she was deemed physically capable. The rationale was simple: to ensure a girl's virginity and secure a long, fertile marriage that would produce heirs. Historical records show that girls were often engaged even younger. The famed Roman historian Tacitus noted that marriages were contracted at a tender age. In Athens, the practice was even more severe. Girls were typically married between the ages of 12 and 14, while their husbands were often in their late 20s and 30s. The Greek philosopher Aristotle stated in his work Politics that women should marry around the age of 18 and men at 37, but this was an ideal and not the reality. For most, the aim was to transfer a girl from the authority of her father to that of her husband as soon as possible, with her dowry serving as a bond. And this practice continued throughout history well into the 19th century. The Middle Ages in Europe continued the tradition of early marriage, driven by the feudal system and the consolidation of land and power. While canon law set the age of marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, these were more of a guide than a strict rule. Engagements could be arranged at a much younger age, often called a betrothal, with the marriage becoming legally binding when the couple reached the designated ages. The English legal scholar Sir Edward Coke noted in the 17th century that a 12-year-old could legally marry and, if she chose, refuse her husband at the age of 12. This was, however, a rare and difficult option. 12-year-old girls were not going to refuse the adults in her life. She had been brought up to accept that marriage was her whole duty. There are some really poignant examples of child brides in history, and now we're going to look at one from the 14th century. So, in the 14th century, after decades of brutal conflict in the Hundred-Year War, the kingdoms of England and France were bleeding from years of fighting. To secure a lasting peace and political alliance, an audacious and controversial bargain was struck. A peace treaty was signed that was to last 28 years, bringing to an end the conflict for a generation. The living symbol of this fragile peace would be a little girl. And so, in 1396, King Richard II of England, then 29 years old and a childless widower, was married to Isabella of Valois, the daughter of the French King Charles VI. She was just 6 years old, a fact that actually shocked and dismayed contemporaries on both sides of the English Channel. At the time of their lavish wedding in Calais, the young princess's bewildered reaction was noted by all, and the French chronicler observed, "The little queen did not know what she was doing, or what was wanted of her." During the opulent wedding feast, she was seen playing with her dolls, a heart-wrenching image of a lost childhood and of a girl completely unaware of the immense political weight she now carried. The marriage was, of course, purely political, and could not be consummated due to Isabella's age. By law and custom, Richard had to wait until his young bride turned 12 before they could live together as husband and wife. But while he waited, he treated her with a curious, almost paternal tenderness. He installed her in her own court with her own ladies-in-waiting, giving her the full respect and title of a queen. And for the next 3 years, she was a symbol of peace, a royal possession in a grand gilded cage, and a living testament to the absurdity of European diplomacy. But this peace was not to last. In 1399, Richard II's reign was brought to a violent end. He was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, and later murdered in prison. The tragedy was compounded for Isabella. At the age of just 12, she was not only a child, but also a widow. She had come to love her husband, a man who had treated her with great kindness, and she was plunged into genuine grief. Her status as a foreign-born child widow made her a political liability to the new Lancastrian reign. She was held captive and, despite her family's pleas, was returned to France only after prolonged negotiations. Her story serves as one of history's most poignant examples of a child's innocence and destiny being entirely dictated by the merciless demands of power. Her childhood was gone forever. And because Isabella was so young, a new marriage was negotiated on her behalf once again. In 1406, when she was just 16 years old, she was married off once more. She was married to her paternal cousin, Charles of Orleans, who was only 11 himself. He later became the Duke of Orleans in 1407, following the assassination of his father. Tragically, only a few years later, Isabella died in childbirth at the age of 19. Just over 50 years later, in the treacherous landscape of the Wars of the Roses, a young girl's life became a pivotal pawn. Lady Margaret Beaufort was the sole heiress to the Lancastrian claim, a lineage that made her both a prize and a threat. Her destiny was not her own, it was a matter of state. And in 1455, at the age of just 12, she was married to Edmund Tudor, a man nearly twice her age and the half-brother of King Henry VI. Their union was a political move to secure the Lancastrian line, but it came with a tragic personal cost. Historical evidence suggests that Edmund, perhaps driven by the urgency of the unstable political climate, did not wait for his young bride to be physically or emotionally ready for consummation. The marriage was reportedly consummated shortly after the ceremony, a shocking violation of the period's already loose customs. The consequence of this act was devastating. At the age of just 13, Margaret gave birth to her only child, the future King Henry VII. The birth was brutal, and it nearly killed her, leaving her both permanently damaged and unable to bear any more children. A contemporary biographer of Margaret would later write that she was left so sore broken in the travail of her birth of her son. This single act of premature consummation ensured the birth of a king who would found the Tudor dynasty, but it came at the expense of Margaret's body. Her story stands as a harrowing example of how political ambition could not only rob a child of her innocence, but also inflict lasting physical harm. In the following century, another dynastic marriage would set in motion a chain of events that would change England forever. Henry VII, who we've just met, the first Tudor king, sought to secure his new dynasty through a powerful alliance with Spain. The chosen bond was his eldest son, Prince Arthur. In 1501, Prince Arthur, a boy of 15, was married to Katherine of Aragon, a princess of Spain, also aged 15. The wedding was part of a magnificent display of wealth and power, a clear signal that the Tudor dynasty was now part of Europe's elite. The two were sent to Ludlow, where they were expected to consummate their marriage and begin their life together. In the eyes of the law and the church, they were ready to become man and wife, even though in today's eyes they were still just children. But 5 months later, a shocking tragedy struck. Prince Arthur died suddenly, likely from a respiratory illness, and with his death came a controversy that would define the rest of his family's history. Did the young couple ever consummate their marriage? Catherine would later swear on her life that they did not. Henry VIII, who would later marry his brother's widow, would spend 2 decades claiming the opposite, using the Bible to argue that the marriage was cursed. Catherine's life became a living battlefield. Her youthful marriage, which had been arranged for her, sealed with such high hopes, became the legal and religious foundation for Henry VIII's quest for a male heir. That single question, did you and Prince Arthur know each other carnally, would tear England apart, lead to the English Reformation, and send a queen and her daughter into exile. The Renaissance and early modern periods in Europe continued the tradition of child marriage, driven by the feudal system and the consolidation of land and power, specifically among the ruling classes. Lady Jane Grey, for example, the 9 Days Queen, was a tragic example. She was a brilliant scholar, but her fate was sealed by her family's political ambitions. At the age of 16, she was forced into a marriage with the 18-year-old Guildford Dudley, and then she was proclaimed queen, a disastrous scheme that led to her execution. Her life was a stark illustration of how a girl's personhood was subsumed by her family's pursuit of power. Her marriage led to her death, a marriage in which she had no say. Throughout history, girls and women have had no voice. They have been ruled and governed by their families and then by their husbands. And so if they were made to marry, they had to follow suit, or they had to risk being alienated from their family without protection or money. In the early American colonies, child marriage was also very common, though it was less about royal alliances and more about pragmatic survival. In the harsh conditions of the New World, a young bride was seen as a vital asset for starting a family and managing a household. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of a middle class, though, did begin to shift attitudes towards marriage. However, the change was slow and uneven. In 19th century Britain, activists began to speak out against child marriage. While the British Empire debated the ethics of child marriage abroad, the practice continued to cast a shadow at home. In 19th century Britain, with its strict Victorian morality and grand societal reforms, a grim reality persisted. The legal age of marriage was still set at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, with parental consent, a law that harked back to a much earlier era. But the reality was driven less by power politics and more by the harshness of poverty. For families struggling in the squalor of industrial cities, a young daughter could be seen as an expensive burden. In these circumstances, an early marriage, however unsuitable, could provide a home and a form of security. Charles Dickens, the author, among others, would expose this reality in his novels, painting a poignant picture of young girls sold into marriage out of sheer desperation. It was a practice that stood in stark contrast to the era's self-professed progress, a sign that even as Britain looked outward to reform other cultures, it was still grappling with the tragic echoes of an older, more brutal time within its own borders. It wouldn't be until the 20th century that the marriage age was legally raised. That took place in 1929, where the Age of Marriage Act was passed. This was a landmark change. It raised the minimum age for both males and females to 16 in England and Wales. It also made marriages below this age void, meaning that they were legally invalid. And looking globally, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, stated that marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of the intending spouses. This was a direct condemnation of child and forced marriages. Today, organisations like UNICEF and the WHO continue to combat the practice with the focus on education, poverty reduction, and legal reforms. But as we know, there is still much to be done. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, please like, subscribe and comment, and I shall endeavour to do more.